I never told my new wife that the farmhouse we moved into after our wedding was mine. I let her believe I was just a retired handyman who had been lucky enough to rent the place cheap from an old friend. In looking back now, that one small omission, that one quiet decision I made the night before our wedding, turned out to be the only thing that saved me from losing everything I had spent 40 years building. My name is not important. What matters is that I am 64 years old. I live in a small town outside of Knoxville, Tennessee. And 18 months ago, I made the fastest, most foolish, and somehow most fortunate decision of my life. I got married again. My first wife, Carol, passed away 6 years before all of this happened. Pancreatic cancer. We had 31 years together, raised 2 kids. My son Daniel, who lives up in Cincinnati with his family, and my daughter Patricia, who stayed close to home and checks in on me more than I probably deserve. Carol and I built everything from nothing. We started with a little savings account and a dream, and over the decades we turned it into something real. The farmhouse on 12 acres outside of town. A rental property on the east side. A storage facility that I still run with the help of 2 part-time employees. Nothing flashy. Nothing that would impress anyone at a fancy dinner party. But it was ours, and after she was gone, it became the only thing I had left of the life we made together. For 4 years, after losing Carol, I didn't even think about another woman. I wasn't ready. I threw myself into the storage business, spent weekends fixing fences on the farm, and let Patricia drag me to church every Sunday because she said it would do me good. She was probably right. Grief is a strange thing. It doesn't leave. It just changes shape. Some mornings, I would wake up, and for about 3 seconds, I would forget. And then I would remember, and the weight of it would settle back onto my chest like a stone. It was Patricia who first told me I needed to get out more. Not to find someone, she said, just to be around people again. So I started going to the Thursday evening community dinners at the church hall. I helped coach a youth baseball team in the spring. I started having coffee at the diner on Saturday mornings with a group of retired men who mostly talked about football and complained about their knees. That was how I met Renee. She came into the diner one Saturday morning with her friend Louise, who happened to know one of the men in my group. Louise made introductions all around, and somehow Renee ended up in the chair across from me. She was 58 years old, recently relocated to the area from Chattanooga, she said, and she had the kind of easy laugh that fills a room without trying. She was warm and funny, and she asked me questions like she was genuinely interested in the answers. We talked for 2 hours that morning. I drove home thinking it was the best conversation I had in years. We started meeting for coffee on our own after that. Then dinner once or twice. I told myself it was nothing serious, just company, just the pleasant feeling of having someone to talk to who wasn't my daughter or my retired friends talking about the Vols game. But somewhere in those months, my guard came down. Renee was attentive and kind. She would call just to check in. She remembered small things I mentioned. That I liked peach pie, that I had a bad knee from an old work injury, that Carol and I used to take drives to the Smoky Mountains every fall. She made me feel seen in a way I had forgotten was possible. She had a son from her first marriage. His name was Brandon, and he was 22 years old. She mentioned him often, always warmly. He was between jobs, she said, trying to figure things out. He was a good kid, just needed a little time to find his footing. I nodded and said I understood. I thought I did. 8 months after that first Saturday morning at the diner, Renee and I got engaged. I know how that sounds. I knew how it sounded then. Patricia sat across from me at my kitchen table when I told her and went very still in the way she does when she is trying to choose her words carefully. She said she was happy for me if I was happy. She said she just wanted to make sure I was thinking clearly and not moving too fast. I told her I was 64 years old and had been alone for 4 years and I was tired of being careful about everything. She hugged me and told me she loved me, but her eyes said something different. Daniel called me from Cincinnati and was more direct. He said, "Dad, you've known this woman for less than a year. What do you actually know about her?" I told him I knew enough. He went quiet for a moment and then said, "Okay, just protect yourself." I told him I would. I thought I meant it. The wedding was small, just family and a few close friends at the church. Renee wore a cream-colored dress. She cried during the vows, which made me tear up too. Patricia stood beside me and smiled the whole time. and I told myself that everything was going to be fine, that I had made the right decision, that Carol would have wanted me to have someone to share my life with. That night, the night before the wedding, I had done something I told no one about. I had made a decision. It started a few weeks earlier. Renee and I had been talking about what life would look like after we were married. Practical things, where we would live, how expenses would be handled, what our day-to-day would look like. I had naturally assumed we would live at the farmhouse. It was mine, it was paid off, and it was where I had built my life. But Renee had made a comment that stopped me cold. She said that she had always imagined having a place in town, closer to stores and restaurants, somewhere more convenient. She said the farmhouse was lovely, but it was a lot of maintenance, and maybe at our age we didn't need all that space. I listened and said I would think about it, but something about the way she said it, at our age, as if she had been calculating our circumstances, settled uncomfortably in my chest. Then a week later, her son Brandon came to visit. He was a tall, broad-shouldered young man with an easy smile and restless eyes. He shook my hand firmly and called me by my first name, which I noticed. We had dinner together at the farmhouse, and at some point he walked through the living room, looked out the back windows at the acreage, and said, almost to himself, "Man, this is a nice piece of land." I smiled and didn't say anything. That night, after Renee and Brandon had gone back to her apartment in town, I sat on the porch for a long time and listened to the crickets and the distant sound of a truck on the highway. I thought about what Daniel had said, protect yourself. I thought about the way Brandon had looked at my land and the way Renee had talked about moving somewhere more convenient before we were even married. I called my lawyer the next morning. I asked about options. He talked to me for an hour about trusts and title structures and the difference between separate property and marital property. I signed some paperwork that afternoon. I made sure that what I had built was protected, regardless of what came next. And then that evening, when Renee asked how my day had been, I said I had run some errands and done a little maintenance on one of the storage units. Which was also true. I did not lie exactly, I just did not offer information that had not been asked for. I told myself that if Renee was the woman I believed her to be, none of it would ever matter. The legal protection would sit quietly in a folder in my lawyer's office and never need to be used. We would build a new life together, and one day I would probably tell her about it, and we would laugh. That is not what happened. We had been married for 3 weeks when Renee first brought up the farmhouse title. We were sitting at the kitchen table after dinner. It was a Tuesday, an ordinary evening, and I remember thinking earlier that day that things were going well, that the adjustment of sharing a home was going smoothly, that I had made the right choice. And then she set down her coffee cup and said she had been doing some thinking. She said she had been reading up on property laws in Tennessee, and she thought it made sense for both of us to have the farmhouse put in both our names. For security, she said. For the future. She said she had spoken to someone, she didn't say who told her that in the case of one spouse passing, the surviving partner was better protected if the property was jointly titled. I looked at her across the table. I kept my face neutral. I said I would need to think about it. She said she had already found out the name of a title company that could handle the paperwork quickly. She said it was really just a formality and it would give them both peace of mind. I said I understood and that I would look into it. That night, I lay in the dark for a long time. I told myself there could be an innocent explanation. People do think about these things, especially after second marriages. It wasn't necessarily calculated. It was possible she was just being practical. But she had spoken to someone. She had already found a title company before she had even raised it with me. That detail would not leave my mind. The next morning, I drove into town to pick up some supplies for the storage facility. On the way back, I stopped by Patricia's house. She was in her garden when I pulled up, and she wiped her hands on her jeans and looked at me the way daughters look at their fathers when they already know something is wrong. I told her what Renee had asked. Patricia went still again. That same careful stillness from when I told her about the engagement. Then she said, "Dad, 3 weeks." I didn't say anything. She said, "She's been in our house for 3 weeks and she's already asking to be put on the deed." I told her I knew how it sounded. She said, "What did you tell her?" I told her I said I would think about it. Patricia looked at me for a long moment and then said quietly, "Don't." I drove home and called Daniel. He listened without interrupting until I was done. Then he was quiet for a moment and said, "What do you know about her finances, Dad? What do you actually know?" I realized I knew very little. I knew she had relocated from Chattanooga. I knew she had relocated from Chattanooga. I knew she had a son who was between jobs. I knew she rented an apartment in town before we got married. I did not know anything about debt or credit or what her financial situation actually looked like. That afternoon, while Renee was visiting her friend Louise, I called a man I had heard about through a friend, someone who did background research, discreet and thorough. I gave him Renee's full name and the city she had come from. He called me back in 4 days. What he told me settled into my stomach like a cold stone. Renee had 2 outstanding personal loans taken out in Chattanooga, both significantly past due. There was a civil judgment against her from 18 months ago. A landlord in Hamilton County who had pursued her for unpaid rent. Her son Brandon had a more complicated history as well, including an incident involving financial fraud charges that had been reduced and eventually settled. I sat in my truck in the parking lot of the storage facility and read the report twice. Then I folded it and put it in the glove compartment and sat there for a while watching a sparrow on the fence post. I thought about Carol. I thought about the early years when we had nothing and worked ourselves to exhaustion to build something. I thought about the winter we couldn't afford to fix the furnace and we slept in the living room with space heaters and made a game of it for the kids. I thought about Carol's hands, the way they looked when she was working, capable and unhurried. I thought about what it would mean if everything we had built together ended up in someone else's hands, because I had been lonely and had let my guard down. I went home and made dinner. I did not say anything. The following Saturday, Brandon came to visit again. He and Renee sat in the living room while I finished up some things in the kitchen, and I could hear their conversation through the open doorway. They weren't being careless exactly, but they weren't whispering either. I heard Brandon say something about the storage units and how many are there. I heard Renee say something about taking time and not pushing too fast. I heard Brandon say, "But you asked him about the title already?" And Renee said, "He said he would think about it." Brandon said something I couldn't fully make out, but the last part was clear enough. He said, "That's the one thing we need." I stood very still at the kitchen counter with a dish towel in my hands. Then I put the dish towel down, walked to the doorway, and said dinner would be ready in about 20 minutes. They both looked up and smiled at me. Brandon said that smelled great. Renee asked if there was anything she could help with. I said no. I had it under control. That evening, after Brandon left, I sat on the porch alone and watched the sun go down behind the tree line. I had a decision to make, and I knew it. I was not angry exactly. The anger had burned out quickly and left something quieter in its place. A kind of clarity. The sort that comes when you finally stop hoping that something is other than what it is. I called my lawyer the following Monday morning. I explained the situation in full. He listened carefully and told me what my options were. Because of the paperwork we had signed before the wedding, the farmhouse and the other properties remained in my name alone and were protected as separate property under Tennessee law. He said if I decided to move forward with the separation, my assets were secure. I told him I would be in touch. That week, I was quieter than usual. Renee noticed and asked a few times if I was all right. I said I was just tired. She made me tea one evening and sat beside me on the couch and held my hand. And I looked at her and felt something complicated. Not hatred, not even anger, but a deep and exhausted sadness for the version of her I had believed in. For the woman with the easy laugh at the Saturday diner, I wasn't sure anymore how much of that had been real. On a Thursday evening, I asked her to sit down at the kitchen table. I told her I had been thinking about the property title question she had raised. I said I had looked into it carefully, and I was not comfortable making that change at this point in our marriage. I said I thought it was too early, and that I felt we needed more time to build trust before making decisions of that magnitude. She looked at me steadily for a moment. Then she said she understood, but that it hurt her that I didn't trust her. She said it felt like I didn't see her as a real partner. She said she had left her whole life in Chattanooga to be here with me, and the least I could do was make her feel secure. I told her I was sorry she felt that way, and that I cared about her, and that if we were patient and built our life together honestly, there would be nothing to worry about. I said if it turned out we genuinely couldn't work through this, I would understand. Her expression shifted just slightly, just for a second. Something behind the hurt. Then she composed herself and said she just needed me to understand where she was coming from. I said I did. 2 weeks later, she told me she didn't think the marriage was working and that she thought she needed to move out for a while to clear her head. She said she was sorry and that she had tried, but she felt like I didn't fully let her in. She said she hoped we could work through it eventually. She moved her things out on a Saturday morning. Brandon came with a truck to help. He was polite and efficient and did not look me in the eye. When they were done, he shook my hand in the driveway and said he hoped things worked out. I said I appreciated him coming to help. Then they drove away down the long gravel driveway, and I stood there until the sound of the truck faded out on the highway. I went inside and made a pot of coffee and called Patricia. She answered on the second ring. I told her what had happened. There was a pause, and then she let out a long breath and said, "Dad, are you okay?" I thought about it for a moment, looking out the kitchen window at the pasture and tree line and the light coming through the leaves. I thought about Carol. I thought about 31 years of something real. I thought about 4 years of learning to carry the weight of losing her. I thought about a lonely Saturday morning at a diner and an easy laugh and how desperately I had wanted it to be true. I told Patricia I was okay. Not great, not happy exactly, but okay. And that was the truth. She drove over that afternoon with a peach pie, which she knew I liked. We sat on the porch and ate it and didn't talk too much. The weather was cool, and the horses in the far field were moving slowly the way they do in the afternoon, and the farm was quiet the way it only gets when it's just you and the people who actually belong there. Later, when the light was going, she asked me if I regretted it. Any of it. I thought about that question for a while before I answered. I told her I didn't regret protecting what Carol and I had built. Not for 1 second. She squeezed my hand and said she was glad. I told her I did regret being lonely enough to move so fast. I told her I regretted not listening when she went still and chose her words carefully. I told her I would do better next time at hearing what wasn't being said. She leaned her head against my shoulder the way she used to do when she was little, and we watched the last of the light go out of the sky. I learned something through all of this that I wish I had understood at the beginning. Loneliness is a real thing. It is heavy and it is honest, and there is no shame in it. But loneliness can make you see what you want to see instead of what is actually there. It can make you mistake performance for feeling and availability for love. It can make you move fast when everything in you should be telling you to slow down. What I know now is this. The people who are genuinely in your corner will still be there if you take your time. They will not make you feel guilty for being careful. They will not need something from you before trust has had a chance to grow. The ones who push you toward a decision before you're ready are usually not pushing for your sake. Trust your instincts. Protect what you built, and if someone is more interested in what you own than in who you are, you will know it, if you let yourself know it. I'm still at the farmhouse. Patricia still comes for dinner on Sundays. Daniel calls every couple of weeks and asks how the storage business is doing. In the spring, I planted Carol's rose bushes along the south fence, the one she always meant to get to and never did. They came in better than I expected. I am 64 years old, and I still have everything that matters. That has to be enough, and most days it really is.